value that's directly before this. Again, more detail than I want to be able to get into here, but general idea. Again, you have to find a way of making sure that the things that you don't want to see aren't there if you want serializability. You have to lock the things that aren't there. So in SQL, you begin a transaction either by saying begin transaction or beginning implicitly. If you don't say begin transaction, by the way, in SQL, there are two modes that you can have. If you don't say begin transaction, it can be something where every SQL statement you do is a transaction by itself. Or you also can have a mode where if you don't say begin transaction, as soon as you do a SQL statement, you've started a transaction, and that transaction will proceed with as many statements as you have in it until you say commit transaction or commit work, or of course you could always end up rolling it back as well. So again, you can either explicitly begin the transaction or have it implicitly begin. There is a notion, and again, this would be a long discussion I'm not going to try to have, but I'll just give you the idea. There can be a notion of a save point. If you have long transactions, and long transactions and nested transactions would be a whole long 2 or 3 lecture topic. The idea is I'm doing something where my transaction takes, let's say, 5 minutes. And I don't want to have my transaction, if there's a failure, I don't want to have it blown back to the beginning. So I can have a save point where I'm saying, I want to save the work that's existed so far, so that even if things go away, I will be able to come back to the work that I've done. It hasn't committed yet, but I will be able to get back to this point in the transaction where I've done 2 minutes of the transaction rather than having to go back to the beginning. Okay, that's the general idea of a save point. Well, lots of longer nested transactions are a fascinating subject. Transactions may be read-only or read-write. In a read-only transaction, you're not allowed to write. In a read-write transaction, you are. The default is read-write. And we have, again, serializability. Now, this is where I wanted to mention something important to you. I want to tell you what I used to think and what I think now. Because what I think now is what the world thinks, which is another one of these instances in which I'm wrong. Serializability is so pretty and so beautiful. You get all of your consistency maintained because if it's serializable and every transaction preserves consistency, then serializability means that you preserve consistency. Because even though it's not a serial schedule, it's as if it was. And so all of your consistency properties that the database is preserving or that their application is preserved, all of them end up being preserved. That's really nice. That's really wonderful. With repeatable read, even with snapshot isolation, I don't get serializability. I can have some of my consistency things blown away. In 180, I give you an example with A less than B, where even with snapshot isolation, I can end up having my consistency condition on A less than B broken, even though every transaction tries to preserve it, but the interaction of them, blows that away. Now here's a statement where I'm not going to be able to prove things to you. I can't explain this. It's just true. There have been proofs that the bumblebee doesn't know how to fly. Try telling that to the bumblebee and see if it says, oh, I didn't know that, I'm going to fall down. Things can break because people run with a typical default, which is either read committed or repeatable read, or in some cases, fewer than I thought, snapshot isolation. Serializability is beautiful, it's wonderful, it's nice, it's neat, but it doesn't have the same response time and throughput that the weaker isolation levels have. So you can insist on having wonderful consistency. Database systems don't even have serializable as their defaults anymore. For a while, some of them did, they lost. Because people care about response time and throughput like crazy, and they notice when the response time goes down. Oh, with my system, you can go ahead and get the response time through all these queries in such better time, and I'm going to be able to run twice as many queries or 100 times as many queries or whatever it is. People notice that. If you don't have serializability, things might break on consistency. But let me tell you, people run with the lower levels, and one of the following things is probably true. Either it doesn't happen because of the nature of the transactions that you break the consistency, Or it does happen and people don't notice. Or it does happen and people don't care. Or it does happen and it ends up getting fixed. Tolerated, prevented. I gave a talk, actually I prepared it with this guy, Pat Helland, who I've mentioned to you several times, at this conference that he and I helped run, High Performance Transaction Systems Workshop. It was a talk which was called Inconsistency and Outconsistency. Outconsistency, Pat tells terrible, wonderful, bad jokes, more than me. This one is my fault. I made up the word outconsistency to mean the outward appearance of consistency. And I tried to explain this, and I went through and I talked about how this stuff gets, dealt with and all the techniques, and I wanted people to tell me how it works in the real world, and I've worked at a number of companies, and I saw in some cases how it gets worked out. It's not something which systematically ends up getting discussed. What I will emphasize to you is that there are things that people notice and things that people don't notice and don't care about or can apologize for when it happens. As an example, which doesn't necessarily show up for this reason, there are cases where Amazon may end up having multiple things in your shopping cart, even though you reduced it down to one. I wanted to decide whether I wanted to get product A or product B. And I had both of them on my shopping cart, and then I deleted, A because B was a better price or came more quickly or whatever it is. There are cases where Amazon potentially would end up shipping you both A and B. Horrors! You get both A and B, you complain to Amazon, they say, okay, we'll only charge you for one of them. Sometimes they'll ask you to send back A, sometimes they'll just say, keep it, it's not worth it. There is a business cost to making that choice. A customer who gets pissed off, sending both A and B when the customer only paid for B. There's also a business cost in having reduced response time, throughput, or scalability, elasticity, being able to go forward. You know what Amazon cares more about and what the customers care more about? How annoyed are you going to be about getting both A and B and being able to retain A? Not really that annoyed. So there's a trade-off, which I wish I could describe in a systematic way how that gets handled. I can't. All I know is, and this also potentially shows up in microservices, I'm actually trying to write up something that talks about some of the microservice-related issues on this. All that I can tell you is people notice and they care about latency, which is response time, throughput, and scalability. And they don't care that much about getting an extra product. If it turns out that two people get promised that they're going to get the product delivered by Friday, and one of them has to get it by Tuesday instead, this is Pat's apology-oriented computing, not a big deal. It can happen because the warehouse burnt, or the truck driver had an accident, or the same last product got sold twice. You try to prevent it, but you don't try to the extent that you stop being able to get the response time, the throughput, and the scalability. So there are trade-offs here where I can tell you consistency is wonderful, but it's not the only value. So in terms of the discussion on locking, to get serializability, you take long-term read-write locks, meaning you don't release them until the end of the transaction, strict two-phase locking. And you also maintain locking on the things that aren't there by some of the techniques that I hand-waved about earlier. With respect to repeatable read, I want to be careful. What's on the slide isn't quite right. Repeatable read doesn't prevent phantoms, but it also doesn't really hold long-term read-write locks on the real objects. What really happens in practice when you have repeatable read is you have copies of the data. You allow other people to write the data. You keep the value that existed when you read it, but other people can write it. So what's on the slide isn't quite right. Let me say that one again. With repeatable read, I read A. Lots of other people can update A. When I read A, I see the same value each time. So I have a version. This is something related to multi-version concurrency control, which we're not going to say nearly enough about. I will mention it later. But the general idea is I have my version. That version can't get updated. It's a previous version. Other people can update the data. My version is my version. I'm in my own world. I look at the data that existed there. Okay? And that's what repeatable read is. Read committed, I only read committed records. When I only read committed records, what I'm going to do is I will have long-term write locks for the things that I want to write. But the things that I want to read, I will grab a read lock when I'm reading it to make sure it's not being changed while I'm reading it. But then I'll drop the read lock, the shared lock. I will read a committed record. I will make sure that everything that I read has been committed. But I won't hold a read lock until the end of the transaction. I will read it to make sure that, again, I read committed values. But I will not hold that read lock until the end of the transaction. And with read uncommitted, locks, what are locks? A last fast mentions, questions on this before I also tell you a little bit about snapshot isolation. Questions? Okay, so locking relates to these isolation levels. A fast mention, I mentioned with a repeatable read, you read a version. With snapshot isolation, that's the way things work too. There's a first read that you do when you're working with snapshot isolation. You're reading the data as it existed at logical time, 23. Which basically says a certain set of transactions committed before time 23, and a certain set of transactions are still ongoing. They committed, but I only care about the transactions that committed before time 23. And with snapshot isolation, I read everything that was committed before time 23. I read A as of time 23, the first thing that I read. I read B as of time 23, even though a whole lot of other things changed on B in between when I read A and I read, but I read the value of B that existed at time 23. The transactions that committed before time 23. I read the latest value from them. So with snapshot isolation, the only things that I read are the things that existed at logical time 23 and my own changes. I always see my own changes. Question?
So are you potentially storing the entire database in your own computer? Because how else are you keeping that snapshot?
First of all, it's not stored in your computer, it's stored in the database. Nobody trusts your own computer to do it. It's part of a logical part of the system. It's not inside your own computer. The other thing is, if you have a transaction that is potentially going to be reading everything in the database, it's probably a really terrible transaction. If that's going to go on. The only cases in which you're doing an incredible amount of reading are situations in which the data is basically immutable. The data isn't changing. So for example, if I'm doing stuff with MapReduce /Hadoop /Spark, I'm looking at data where the data might be append only, but the data really is not changing underneath. So things in which I look at lots and lots of data, OLAP sorts of things, are things in which the data is either immutable or append only, pretty much. Okay, transactions and constraints. Again, briefly mentioned in 180, I'm going to remind you about this here. It's a different kind of constraint. I have table A, in which I have a key, which I'm calling A key, and B has a key, which I'm calling B key. And each of them has a foreign key that refers to the other. Example in practice, which I mentioned in 180. You've got people and you've got houses. People live in houses. So there's a foreign key reference inside people to houses. Houses have landlords, somebody who owns the house. Assume that the landlords are people. So people reference houses and houses reference people. Each of them references the other. And there's a problem. Each of them references the other. How do you insert a tuple into either houses or people? You can't do it. I'm going to insert a house. The house has a landlord, but there aren't any people. So I'm violating my constraint. Well, so I'll go ahead and put in a person, but the person lives in a house. There's no house. So this ends up being a problem. The way that would get dealt with in practice is you insert them in the same transaction, and you defer the constraint checking until the end of the transaction. What actually happens in practice is you might load a whole bunch of persons and landlords and do the checking after that load ends up being completed. It might be a load rather than insert, at the time, but you still want to check the constraints that are there. And SQL has constraint modes: deferred, which says check it at commit time, and immediate, which basically says statement by statement, be checking what's going on. So again, we have the 4 ACID properties, and we've started in on this, where, again, we've been focusing on isolation so far, which is a property that the concurrency control mechanism is talking about. We've been talking about locking as a concurrency control, CC mechanism. And again, this is what's called pessimistic locking. It prevents there being problems. By the time I get to commit, I don't have any locking problems. I don't have any conflict problems because locking has prevented the conflicts. So this is pessimistic because I'm basically saying, I'm gonna make sure that I don't have any conflicts when I'm trying to commit. That's the way the thing ends up operating. But, in terms of the implementation of the lock manager, how does this work? Our friend the hash table shows up yet again. Remember what a lock consists of? A lock is a triple. A lock is a triple. A lock consists of a transaction ID and RID. Again, we're locking tuples. We're locking an RID. So I have a lock ID, I have a transaction ID, XID, I have an RID, and the record, and I've got the mode, which is so far only shared and exclusive. There are other lock modes which we haven't gotten to yet, but we will talk about. And then basically, what I will do is, for the RID, I will have the mode in which that thing is locked. Okay, and there can be a lot of different people who have it locked in S mode. There can't be multiple that have it in X mode, but there can be a lot that have it in S mode. So for that particular RID, inside my hash lock table, I hash on the RID, I have the list of people who have the lock in shared mode, or the one guy who has it in X mode, exclusive mode, right? But I also keep track of the people who are waiting for the lock. And there could be a bunch of people who are waiting for the lock. But I do that based on the RID, so I've got a hash table based on the RID. Okay? And when I go ahead and I do a release, a particular transaction releases the lock on that record, then I change the list of transactions holding that lock. He unlocked, he no longer holds it. He no longer holds that lock. And I go ahead and I look at the head of the wait queue, I can now grant a request to whoever is waiting on the wait queue, unless there are others. So if I have 5 people who have shared mode, and the guy waiting on the list, the head of the list is X mode, and it would have to be in X mode since other people with shared mode would have been able to grant the shared lock. So I will end up taking the guy who's head of the list, whether he wants S or X, and he ends up getting the mode that he wants, if nobody's holding the lock. Again, if there were 5 people holding it in shared mode and one of them gives it up, there's still 4 people holding it in shared mode. The guy who wants X at the head of the queue can't proceed. And then I keep doing this until the head of the queue can't be run. What do I mean by that? If somebody had the lock in X mode and gives it up, and there are 12 people, the first 12 people in the queue want S mode, I can give it to all of them. But as soon as I come to one guy who wants it in X mode, S and X are incompatible. So I will be able to give the shared mode lock to 12 guys at the top of the queue. But I won't be able to give it to the 13th guy, unlucky, triskaidekaphobia, fear of the number 13. I won't be able to give it to the 13th guy in the queue because he wants it in right mode, he can't get it. Okay? A lock request is handled with a test and set, a mutex, a semaphore, whatever you want to do. It has to be an atomic operation. I mean atomic at the operating system / hardware level. It's something where you have to see, is the lock being held? And if so, give it and make sure that this gets handled atomically. So somebody comes in and wants a lock. either somebody already holds the lock or they don't. And there can be races where two guys are asking for compatible or incompatible locks at the same time. I wanna make sure that this gets handled as an atomic operation. Really important kind of stuff to do. And again, I don't mean database atomicity, I mean, I don't wanna say, oh, is the lock held? No, it isn't. Well, I'm gonna grab the lock. Somebody else comes in, sees if it's being held, grabs the lock, and I'm wrong. At the time I looked, it wasn't being held, now it is being held. I need to do this as something which ends up being atomic. There is a special kind of request for a lock which is called a lock upgrade. That gets preferential treatment. Highly unfair, but you need to do it. What's a lock upgrade? I've got an S lock. I want to be able to grab an X lock. That gets preferential treatment if it's possible to do over other people who want X locks. Can I get, if I have an S lock, can I be upgraded immediately to an X when I want it? No, because there are several other people who might have S locks. So again, my wanting an X locks gets favored, but it may not always be able to work. I was asked last time about hotspots. Great subject. Hotspots can happen because, for example, suppose that I'm out of time. Last comment, a lot of people want to be able to get access to, for example, suppose that I have a super implementation where for an entire bank, I'm keeping the total amount of money in the entire bank, and I'm upgrading that all the time. You know what happens if I do that at the beginning of my transaction? Well, it's a stupid design to begin with, but suppose I'm doing that at the beginning of every transaction. Nobody else can proceed because they won't be able to proceed unless they can get an update on the bank total. It's very bad. I mean, it's a bad design in general, but if I'm gonna follow something like that, where maybe I don't keep it for the entire bank, but I keep it for a branch of the bank, do it as the last thing in the transaction, right before I'm about to commit the transaction. I'll talk more about this next time. We're gonna have to run over to the other class. But again, the question is, we'll talk a little more about ways that you can break up hotspots. What are hotspots? Why do you want to break them? How do you break them? Lots of stuff here. And there are a lot of people who seem to be maybe looking over the slides for this talk if this is going on. If what you're doing is you're doing homework for another course and not following this, bad idea. I'm not gonna stop you from having